So there's been a lot of talk recently about what Nintendo is going to do in 2021. And that makes sense because we're just about at the end of 2020 now. Once again, a year that's felt like a decade about to come to an end. But 2021 is going to be a big year for Nintendo, especially if you look at it more in their fiscal year terms. So like next April to March of 2022 is going to be massive for Nintendo. That's going to cover their holiday. They'll most likely have their Zelda Breath of the Wild 2 release, their Zelda 35th anniversary, several big announcements from the Pokemon company and Nintendo. So a lot of things happening here. So software seems to be down pat on that side. But the question has become now for a lot of people, will Nintendo do something on the hardware side with a revision? Because as we're seeing more and more reports come out, it is kind of coming into the news a bit more about Nintendo maybe doing a revision. And I do believe that they will do one. And I think it's going to happen in the first half of next year. I even picked out a date for fun because we'll do some predictions here, and I'll talk about how I think Nintendo is going to go about creating a Switch Pro, quote unquote, and I don't think it's necessarily going to be what a lot of people consider a Pro model. In fact, it might be kind of disappointing, but I think it's falling right in line with what Nintendo's plans are for the Switch going forward. Guys, enjoy these videos. Make sure that like button helps out a ton. And if you're new here to the following channel, make sure you subscribe down below. And we're going to start today with the sponsor for today's video. Today's video is sponsored by the Command Shell from Manji. So last month, I did a bunch of drop tests with the Manji Command Shell and was happy with the results, with my Switch being completely protected from several falls, we'll say. Now, I haven't dropped the Switch since then, but the peace of mind knowing it's protected well is great to have. This case protects your Switch all the way around while still giving the freedom of removing your Joy-Con controllers on the fly. In fact, the added thickness of the casing on the Joy-Cons make holding them in single Joy-Con play more comfortable. I also like the straps on the back of each Joy-Con so that when you're laying down, holding onto the Switch is actually a lot easier. With the extra large kickstand on the back, dropping the Switch into tabletop mode is very easy. The Manji Command Shell makes a great gift for anyone getting a Nintendo Switch, or is a good addition to any Christmas list that already has a Switch on it. Order now and shipments will arrive in time for Christmas. So head on over to their website at the link in the description below. Once again, thanks to Manji for sponsoring the video. Now in April, Mike Heskin actually spotted in the update firmware 10.0.0 that there were different profiles spotted for different bits of hardware configurations for the Switch, and one of those was like NX ABCD. So it wasn't exactly named well, but it was a slot that was taken up, and there was a lot of speculation after that Nintendo would release a new piece of hardware in 2020. However, after that, we did have the president of Nintendo come out and say, we won't be releasing any new hardware this year, and it was probably a good idea, because in the most recent MPD results, Nintendo actually struggled to get Switch systems out to meet demand, and they actually dropped 5% year over year for November for the Switch. So like it was just overall them having a hard time getting supply out. Can you imagine them also trying to develop a revision next to that? That would be kind of tough. And especially during the holiday season, seems like it makes a lot more sense to get into next year by several months before you start talking about the next Switch system. So as we get into next year, Nintendo gets their supply line all figured out and they start producing more and more Switch systems and they're more comfortable with the demand being met for the Switch. They'll look to move into marketing for their Switch revision to continue sales on the trajectory that they're going now. They just sell us all another Switch. That's what they'll do, and it'll probably work. I mean, it's worked just by having different colors of the Switch. Like, you imagine if they announce a Switch Pro and tell you that, yeah, we'll play your games better. A lot of us are probably just going to go buy it then and I don't know, put our old Switch in a drawer somewhere or even trade it in. But either way, it will certainly spike sales for the hardware even further. So the first thing we got to figure out is what would they call this Switch revision, the Switch Pro? Pro seems to be what everyone leans into because Pro suggests the higher end model in a line of hardware. And yeah, I mean, we see it, the PS4 Pro, right? The iPad Pro, that makes sense. But Nintendo doesn't usually make sense when it comes to this kind of stuff. So I'm going to say the basic new Nintendo Switch. I think that's what they're going to do. It worked for the 3DS, so why not the Switch? Although I do still like Super Nintendo Switch. That's a fun one there. I mean, there's a lot of names that are popping up online, and hey, someone got the Switch Lite correct, so let me know your best guess. All right, now the big question, how does Nintendo create the Switch revision or the new Nintendo Switch without spending too much money. That's what Nintendo likes to do. They'll take older hardware and they'll kind of repurpose it. They'll put some really good games with it and it'll sell well, and they'll make more money from it. I mean, the X1 is a chip that from 2015 with Nvidia, and it just never found a home. It just didn't sell well because Nvidia made a good chip, but they didn't really have the software or the marketing to push it along to mass market and have consumers buy it up in droves like the Switch has. So the deal apparently was Nintendo went to them, got the X1 at a good price in bulk, put it in the Switch, and here we are now with the Switch probably having crossed 70 million units by now based on the latest NPD and the results in Japan. So it seemed to work out for everyone there. But even so, I don't think Nintendo will want to have two things. I don't think they want to spend a lot of money on this revision because they'd rather do that with the next generation Switch as technology continues to improve several years from now. And I don't think they want it to be too big of a jump because then it'll make their next generation system feel like less of a jump. That's something we've run into with the Xbox One X and even the PS4 Pro going up to the Series X and the PS5. I don't think Nintendo is too interested with different companies, third-party companies, creating games specifically for this new Switch. They did it a little bit with the 3DS, even Nintendo taking part in that, and it didn't work out terribly well for them outside of Minecraft, but Minecraft sells on everything. But the other games didn't sell as well, but it was nice to know that if you have the new 3DS XL system, games would load faster and run better on it. That's what a lot of us want right now with the Switch itself. We just want those games that are really, really good just to run better. Currently inside of the Switch, the newer one with the better battery life, they're using a modified X1. It's been moved down to 16 nanometers, so they did shrink it a bit. It gave us better battery life because it's a more efficient chip. It's using LPDDR4X memory, so it did get a bit of an upgrade there, slight speed improvement as well. But there are still some shortcomings with this chip that could be worked and improved on to give us a better experience when it comes to resolution and frame rate. If you've seen videos from MVG, Modern Vintage Gamer, he's showcased how overclocking the system helps, especially if you have patches designated to remove the frame cap. So instead of it being 30 frames per second, you can increase that to 60. And through overclocking, he's actually been able to get things like Witcher 3 on the Switch touching 60 frames per second. So you might be thinking, wow, that's great. They just have to overclock the chip a bit and maybe have a patch. Kind of, but there's still one massive limiting factor. And I talked to several people about this, and everyone kept coming up with the same thing that seems to be limiting the Switch, and it's something that Nvidia has addressed before in another Tegra chip. So I do wonder, because they took the X1 and they revised it a bit, got it to 16 nanometers, if they could do the same thing here, maybe even increase the RAM a little bit. So the biggest problem we're running into right now, and you can see some of the charts here for the different X1 chips, is the memory bandwidth. It's shared across it. So even if you have the T210, the T214, they both have a 64-bit bus with a 25.6 gigabytes per second bandwidth for memory. That is actually a fairly large problem and seems to be the big bottleneck right now that the system is running into. And the solution to this would most likely be what Nvidia did with their Parker chip, or their Tegra X2 that has been dubbed the T186. This is a chip that was apparently used in that Magic Leap headset that I didn't think was ever going to actually come out. They used this Parker chip in there, so at least was in a product that wasn't just a car. So that's good news there. But we can see the spec sheets for this one with a 128-bit bus and 59.7 gigabytes bandwidth. So that actually would heavily improve what we'd be dealing with here, and they could still play around with some of the additional clocks for the GPU itself and the CPU if they wanted to make sure it was taking full advantage of this. So what that would end up doing is, think about games where dynamic resolution will move around quite a bit and alter, and it might get a bit more blurry when a lot of things are happening, and then when you're standing and looking in the sky or down at the ground, it looks a lot cleaner. It would be more or less on the cleaner side, and I could even see them move it up to 8 gigabytes of memory. That's something else that developers have mentioned, is just more memory now as we're moving into the PS5 and the Series X and S generation, where just RAM is very plentiful on different systems now for third parties, kind of moving from 4 to 8, along with the boost in memory bandwidth and a slight overclock, even as MVG himself has mentioned, just to get better performance out of it. All of that come together for a fairly, I'm going to say, cheap alternative to building a whole new chip and trying to do this massive reconfiguration on a board for a Switch Pro. I mean, can you imagine some of these games having a solid 30 or maybe even a patch that would then boost it up to 60 frames per second if you had this newer Nintendo Switch? That alone, for a lot of people, with what we're using now, think of like Doom, where if you're playing that, yeah, it looks kind of blurry, but what if there was a patch that moved it up to 60 frames per second or moved it up to a full 1080p at 30 frames per second? For a lot of people, that would be a pretty good improvement with what they're dealing with. And in handheld mode at 720p, that would most likely just be native like at all times, and you wouldn't have these dips to 600p and 540p. Which brings me to my next point, which would be the screen itself in handheld mode. I don't think it's going to change at all. I actually think it's going to stay almost exactly the same unless there is just some sort of updates in manufacturing and materials that they're using. I think it's still going to be a 720p display. Now, the reason for this is I don't think Nintendo wants to, again, spend money on places where they don't have to. They have the surveys, and they've published it before showing that it's literally half and half where to use your Switch the most. So if they're looking at people who are always docked, is it worth putting money into that screen for now with a revision when no one's really talking much about the screen being a problem in the first place, and we're talking about the system just trying to touch 720p native at all times in handheld mode? I don't think there's any real point in moving it up to 1080p, because then all we'll talk about is how it can't touch the native resolution of the now installed 1080p display. Also, I see no reason why Nintendo should chase the mini LED dream for displays right now. They should save that for their next generation Switch that will happen in a couple of years or so. Let Apple have all of these companies fall over them trying to create more and more mini LED displays, and then do what Nintendo does and kind of slide in towards the end and say, okay, now we'll adopt this technology that's a couple years old. So thinking of ways that they can improve the hardware and stuff without spending too much isn't the difficult part. You know what the difficult part is here? It's the price. Like, how do you go about pricing this thing so that it makes sense to customers that it is a more powerful piece of hardware without putting it out of reach and making it seem too expensive, right? So the most popular thought for price right now is $350. You have $350 on this new Nintendo Switch. You have $300 on the regular Switch. You have $200 on the Switch Lite. And then maybe you introduce a TV-only Switch for like $150 down the road later on or something in the following year towards the end of the Switch's lifespan overall. That could work, but I do kind of think Nintendo will eventually replace the OG Switch, the regular one that we all have now, with this new Nintendo Switch, much like they did with the 3DS XL. Remember, we had the 3DS XL, then the new 3DS XL shows up, and eventually it just kind of phases that one out, the old one, and then the new the new 3DS XL fits right into its place. And it was at like a weird price for a while there, even if, like, eventually it was like $190. Like, people are thinking $350 is a weird price. They had that at like $190 at one point. How weird of a price is that? The other way they can show that it's a different system completely is by actually changing the look of it. That's tough, because the form factor itself, I feel like, is still going to use the same dock. So it has to still be kind of the same form factor. I don't think they'll have any issues with that when it comes to fitting the chip correctly and the memory, all of that stuff that would get improved. I think it'll all fit in there just fine, probably even with the same heatsink, to be honest, no problems there. But like, how do you differentiate it enough? Is a logo on the back enough? Is a logo on the box enough? I mean, if you look at like the newer Switch revision we had with better battery, the only thing that was really that different about it was on the bottom. It was like a dash or a parentheses 01 on the bottom, and that's the way you'd be able to tell. So I feel like just maybe a logo even. Maybe they come out with a completely different color for the shell itself. Maybe, but that's going to be the most interesting part, I think, if they change up the form factor. Because remember, it's still going to use the same Joy-Cons, and it'll probably still fit in the same dock. And then finally, the release date. I picked out a day just for fun, just to see how close I could even be. Who knows? Maybe it doesn't even come out in the first half. Maybe it comes out in like the fall, like they did with the Switch Lite. Very possible there. But I think they're going to release it in May. I have May 14th picked out. That's a Friday, and that means they would probably announce it in April. Maybe the beginning of April, give things like a 40-day run-up period or something, just so retailers can get all of their orders and everything in, because trust me, they don't tell you about the system until after they've announced the system, even if you're a big retailer. I went through all of this before with Nintendo. It was a whole thing, but that's where I'm going with. May 14th. Let me know your best guess down below. It's just for fun. We'll see if anyone even gets it. But those are my thoughts on the theoretical Nintendo Switch Pro that has gained so many headlines over the last 4 years. Basically, since the Switch came out, there's been talk about a Switch Pro, like, constantly. So I do hope that a Switch revision comes out pretty soon, like in the next 6 to 7 months soon. But I have a feeling that there will be a lot of disappointment if it's what I just described, because people are thinking we're going to get what is basically a portable PlayStation 4 system, and I just don't necessarily see it, because Nintendo, in their mind right now, it just needs to be better than the current Switch. It doesn't have to be a PS4 to PS4 Pro situation, it just has to be better than the Switch now. So even like an upgrade like this that would enable it to have 1080p in some instances where we have dynamic resolution, or a 30 frames per second lock, or even 60 frames per second uncapped upgrade, to them, that might be enough. And who knows, maybe there will be third-party games that only make the jump to this. And then for other Switch systems, the older ones, maybe they push the cloud version there. Something to think about for that too. A lot of avenues Nintendo can take right now, and that's why it's a lot of fun to speculate on this stuff. But let me know what you guys think about this one down below. Give me your best guesses, and we'll see if anyone down in the comments can get it right. Thanks guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.